good to start?
Right, we thank Albert for his speech, and now we would like to invite Mark to deliver his speech.
Mr. Speaker, there is one problem when you make your speech too emotional. You lack time in explaining your arguments. We think the development to justify why Borneo should secede isn't enough. It exists in a utopian world, where when you claim Malaysia, or rather the federal government of Malaysia, being very oppressive, we don't necessarily think that the people of Sabah and Sarawak are losing out. If you're looking in the context of the Constitution, Indians and Chinese lose out a lot as comparison to what Sabah and Sarawak individuals are given. So how is that then a justification for you to state that it is unfair for the way Sabah and Sarawak are treated when you receive free education to whatever age that you feel like getting it? We think eventually, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to economic distribution of wealth, we do concede that yes, Sabah and Sarawak has a lot of natural resources, but under the justification of federalism, we think eventually federations have the right to equally distribute those wealth around the countries. We think eventually
equally,
states like, oh wait, let me get to equality later, right? We think eventually, right, states in like Peninsular Malaysia also needs to benefit if there's other states that are willing to contribute to the collective wealth of the country itself. We don't necessarily think that Sabah and Sarawak are losing out. We think development is happening. If the only problem here, Mr. Speaker, is that that development is not up to your expectations. So when your expectations go so high, you expect the federal government to bow down to your knees. We don't necessarily think that that is fair for you to do that. Mr. Speaker, let's go back to history. In 1963, when the Cobalt Agreement was signed, when we were trying to get Malaysia, Singapore, as well as Borneo to combine together as one nation, the Cobalt Agreement had a consensus where 2/3 of Borneans, Sabahs and Sarawak, agreed to be a part of Malaysia. That was the self-determination that was then and still exists until today. We think eventually, Mr. Speaker, under those historical identification of how Sabah and Sarawak saw themselves wanting to be part of Malaysia, holds an important precedent of how now Malaysia calls Sabah and Sarawak as a unit, Mr. Speaker. We think eventually Malaysian government or the Malaysian constitution is not oppressive. Do not fall to a sort of degradation towards a system that is giving Sabah and Sarawak so many personal benefits. We think eventually, if there's anyone who can claim that the constitution is oppressive, Mr. Speaker, is the Indians and Chinese, but we don't see anyone doing that. Let us move on to my arguments, right, on why Sabah should stay. Why Sabah and Sarawak should stay, right? We think we're going to talk about, firstly, the benefits of the federalism. We're going to also talk about the social development, and we're going to talk about the security aspects of what are the sorts of pressure that Borneo is undergoing in status quo, right? Now let's look at the first level, right? The benefits of federalism. We think eventually, Mr. Speaker, it comes down to many different instances. When you look at the economic value that the federal government has provided for Sabah and Sarawak, we don't necessarily think that Sabah and Sarawak were neglected. When you look at major foreign corporations like Shell, who host their headquarters in Miri, we think eventually, Mr. Speaker, the currency value benefits individuals throughout whatever income range that you want. We think eventually, if you want to complain about income range, then you have to increase your ability as a state to actually state, Mr. Speaker, that this is what we deserve. We don't necessarily think that the federal government is going to close a blind eye to the sort of well-being that the people require. We think eventually, when you're talking about the economic benefits, development, progress is happening within status quo. When you look at Sabah, the sort of development is actually coming in to this country, to this state, Mr. Speaker, is bountiful. We look at necessarily, just because there are more rural areas in the state, doesn't necessarily mean that there's no progression at all. Progression is happening. It doesn't mean that it has to be in the same rapid rate that you require. We think eventually rural areas will become states like how the federal territories. And by the way, guys, rural areas exist in every state in the country. Is that enough of a reason for all states to now succeed from the federal government? We don't think so. Mr. Speaker, when you're looking at the aspects of democracy and how Sabah and Sarawak decided to enter into federalism, we think in the end of the day, right, the benefits of federalism was never promised as perfection. We think eventually some mistakes happen, but do we run away from what we have already built for the last 56 years? No. We stand up and we look at progression as equality, Mr. Speaker. We look at progression of how, in my second argument, the social development that we have already obtained in status quo. When you look at how Malaysia recognizes themselves around the world, they don't only claim themselves as Malays, Indian and Chinese, but they also claim themselves as Kadazans and Dayak and Dusos, right? We think eventually the social identity has already integrated between Malaysia's constitution itself. When you're looking at the Cobalt Agreement and how in 1963, when Borneo decided to be part of Malaysia, they also recognized the social development in ensuring that there is proper education that is given to every child within the country itself, that there's any form of welfare that is given, free medical health care, everything is given to you. Just because there is longhouses that still exist within the country and people are not willing to go or migrate to urban areas, it's not enough for a reason to now claim that the government is not trying to cater to your needs. A government cannot be at every place at the same time, Mr. Speaker. The government provides any form of justification. That is why when you look at the political collaboration, for example, alright, before 6, Albert.
Sir, all the benefits that he's just talked to you are not mutually exclusive because they can happen when Borneo is an independent state, number one. But number two, it's also about the question of extent. Yes, some benefits have come, but to what extent compared to Peninsula?
Mr. Speaker, no, it will not happen under your case. Why? Because of the political dependency that already exists in status quo. When you're looking at the willingness of Sabahans and Sarawakian to join the coalition party, for example, the STAR, right, or PPC in Sarawak, we think eventually these political parties want to be in a bigger political collaboration with the federal government. We think this is where representation comes to every single people within the state itself. If you now want all of these political parties to form a state, one, not all political parties or not one political party is the more powerful party than every other. You will still have conflicts arising where all of these political parties would want to have a piece of the cake. You're now given an opportunity for Tayyip to actually be one or to be prime minister. I think that's a bad mistake, but that's right? That's part of federalism happening. We think eventually the collective reasoning, right? When you come and talk about assets like security, it was the federal government that ensured that no harm comes to Lahad Datu when the Zulu started attacking. When you look at how the nation uses the value of Sabah and Sarawak as a value of tourism, when you're looking at how people even nowhere accept the fact that we are under one union, we think eventually, Mr. Speaker, federalism has its advantages. It is not perfect, we understand, but we still provide. There is infrastructure, there is development. We have beautiful campuses like this to exist for everyone, Mr. Speaker. Sabah and Sarawakians have their benefits. For all these reasons, we should stay.
Yeah.